director at the German Historical Institute, taught for a long time at the University of Minnesota, and then was Max Weber Chair at the at NYU, Convender's institution, and is currently involved at the Georg-Eckert Institute in Braunschweig, where she is heading a research area on globalization and world society. She is certainly known to all German historians in Europe and the United States by her book on the Miracle Years, Cultural History of West Germany, 1949-1968, which is no doubt one of the most successful books published over the last 20 years in the United States. And I wish the same fate to another book, which is simply interesting for the title and for what she is talking about today, that is The Nation, Europe, and the World Textbooks and Curricula in Transition, which she edited together with Yasemin Soysal. I think this is all I want to say here. I could say much more, but I have much more, but there we are. Elazar Barkan is from Brandeis University, where he received a PhD in comparative European history. He is currently professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University. That is in itself an interesting and suggestive title, and serves as a co-director of the Human Rights Concentration at the School of International and Public Affairs. His very important books, which I think everyone has read, The Guilt of Nations, Restitution and Negotiating Historical Injustices, then perhaps lesser known but equally important, Claiming the Stones, Naming the Bones, and last but not least, Taking Wrong Seriously, Apologies and Reconciliations. Our commentator will be Dipesh Chakrabarty, who needs no introduction and will not get an introduction.
His name is not Dipesh Chakrabarty, his name is Provincializing Europe.
Well, my research assistant who put this together in the first version actually had...
Why did you say that name of Kautsky once?
my research assistant had the Italian version of Provincializzare. Europa. That sounded so much better.
That's much more interesting, yeah, exactly.
We will leave it at that and start with Hanna.
Yeah, this is a tough act to follow, the interesting debates of the morning and the afternoon, but I'll try my best to keep you awake. So what I want to do in the next 20 minutes or so is first to address the context of history textbooks in a more general manner. I will then second turn to contention over textbooks as it unfolded in the Federal Republic of Germany. And finally, I will outline what would be, in my view, a responsible design for knowledge acquisition in public education at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, many of the points that I'm going to discuss will resonate with the debates that we had in the morning and in the afternoon, especially when it comes to Europe and the question of nation. So first, some brief remarks on the textbook, on the context of history textbooks. Education has been one of the most important tools in the short but determined career of the nation-state as the organizer of collectives. Historically, subjects were transformed into citizens through the teaching of history, geography, and the language of the nation. People were anchored in illustrious paths, in particular territories, and in the grammar of national self-recognition and the logic of collective reassurance. Thus, to quote Eugene Weber, peasants were turned into Frenchmen, Bavarians, Hessians, or Westphalians were turned into Germans, the English, Scots, and the Welsh were turned into Britons, and the Irish, Germans, Mexicans, and Chinese into Americans, and obviously I could go on. While it is true that historiography and the nation-state traditionally have had an intimate relationship, this is particularly true for school historiography. As Aleida Assmann has shown in the 18th and 19th centuries, schooling for the general public and state control of curricula and textbooks were part of the process of nation building and the creation of social cohesion in the interest of the emerging industrial society. Academic historians everywhere have enthusiastically entered the service of the nation-state, thus creating and legitimizing national narratives. In the process of shaping the nation-state, state books did indeed turn into weapons of mass instruction to aid the process and fight anything that would challenge this consolidation. The container model of national history has powerfully marked boundaries and has given meaning to all kinds of issues. It has provided, and continues to do so, orientation on who belongs and who does not. In so doing, the nation-state has since its inception shown its Janus-faced character, oscillating between the ethnocentric blood and soil characteristics and its modern civility. During the last third of the 20th century, however, we have experienced a thorough deconstruction of national history, and I guess everybody who is in this room has played an active role in this process. The deconstruction of the national narrative that focused on social classes, groups, genders, ethnicities, and locales is here to stay, being supplemented by a growing awareness to the issues of a globalizing world, the need to understand its complexities, be these the economic exchange on a worldwide level, the transnational character of politics and communication, competing memories after the end of the Cold War, and the growing importance of post-colonial narrative, be this transnational migration and its transforming impact on host societies, or any number of world historical topics that are gaining in importance and urgency. Having said this, the role of the nation-state in a globalizing world needs to be thought about in new ways, something which goes beyond the scope of this presentation. But this much can be said. The steady expansion of institutions of mass education throughout the 20th century, even in regions of the world where ideological and material sources pose a severe hindrance to its implementation, is an indicator of nation-states' dedication to the idea of forging collective meaning and establishing common values through education to this day. And actually John Mayer and his group in Stanford have done a lot of research on these equalizing tendencies all over the world. And I'm not going into this, although they are very interesting points that they have been put forward. Although national history continues to be history by default practically everywhere, historical accounts nowadays tend to transcend the national narrative and embrace broader historical perspectives. From a world historical perspective, nation-states and their needs for the narration of their origins are but a short moment in history. They have been the pre-modern formations of empires and vast territories without nations. Charles, you alluded to these kind of greater empires, and their particular tension with the project of the nation-states. And there have also been the frequently feudal attempts at identifying nations with modern state formations, conflating ethnicity and statehood. Until today, we have the growing influence of transnational units or even world historical developments that relativize and question the logic of nation-states and, at the same time, reconfirm essential elements of the nation-state, among which education is not the least important. This brings me to my second point, the contention of a textbook as it has unfolded in the Federal Republic. In Germany, after 1945, the occupation powers made sure that the textbooks were cleansed of poisonous nationalistic ideas in different ways in West and in East Germany. Germans subsequently picked up the thread. There was contention over textbooks, and I will just name a few issues in the Federal Republic, neglecting debates in the GDR, because that would really go probably too far. In the 1950s, the question really was, what does it take to be a democratic society? So the way people did it, they hooked on to the democratic traditions in German history, and that played out in a particular interest in the Weimar Republic. This is, of course, was a very indirect way of dealing with the Nazi past. It was so indirect that my generation hardly learned anything in school about Nazism, a silence that only broke in the 60s when the first post-war generation came of age. Then, in the 60s, the Auschwitz trials and the student unrest brought the Nazi past onto the agenda, in public debate as much as eventually also in school curricula and in textbooks. And ever since, we have variations of the coming to terms with the past, and this has also played out in a variety of forms. At first, the framing was dictatorship versus democracy, and the issue was to build a stable democratic society, to acknowledge pluralism, and to adhere to democratic procedure. If there were any personal voices to be heard in the 50s and beginning 60s, it was the voices of German victims. The victims of the Germans were not only largely absent in Germany, having either been killed or having fled, but they were until the Auschwitz trials, eerily quiet. Only in the 70s and 80s, the question of German guilt started to frame narratives. The historians' debate of 1986 about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, as well as the reception of the Wehrmacht exhibit some years later, that showed how deeply the military was involved in the systematic mass killings, testified to this shift. Since the 1990s, the question of whose memory has been framing the debate, being complicated by the fact of German unification in 1990. This debate has, in a country with not too many surviving victims of the Nazi genocide, but with still lots of German victims, occasionally had a very strange twist. And in fact, the way the debate has been conducted in Germany and in the United States need to take this into consideration, that the absence of mostly Jews, but also other victimized population, just is, they are there, but to such a small degree that their voices, on the one hand, are very loud, and on the other, they are very quiet. And in the United States, this debate follows very different paradigms. The fiercest textbook debates really revolved in the 1970s around two issues, and they are very diverse issues. One was the German-Polish textbook recommendations, and the second was the epistemological crisis of historiography, revolving first around social and then around women's history. In 1972, a commission of West German and Polish scholars issued recommendations on how to tell the story of German-Polish relations. That is what Michael Geyer labeled damage control, right? This was in the time of the Cold War, and regular meetings that subsequently occurred, like on a yearly basis, were in themselves a major achievement. That's really where the achievement was in. However, in order to reach some agreement on how to speak about a tormented relationship, especially from 1939 to the post-war era, both sides had to suppress important parts of the historical truth. Thus, the Hitler-Stalin Pact could not be mentioned, neither could the mass expulsion of Germans from what now were Polish lands. This triggered considerable apprehension and protest from the interest groups that represented the expellees, the Vertriebenenverbände in West Germany, and on a general level triggered a debate on whether at all and how to acknowledge the territorial outcome of the Second World War. It also brought to the fore questions whether the truth can be negotiated between bilateral commissions. Politics and scholarships were at times in muddy waters in these questions. The other passionate debate was in the 1970s is more what one would expect, and it occurred in similar ways in many countries. It emerged from the challenge of national history, first by social and subsequently by women's and gender history, to be followed by other identity-based history. With these debates, the issues of structure versus event-oriented history, and subsequently the question of whose history erupted. Now, if I can just give you a short example on how this played out in women's history. Now, we are talking textbooks here. We are not talking the question of like Peter Novik's book on the objectivity question, that noble dream. We are talking textbooks. Now, what people would do is write their usual narrative, their national narrative, and then they would add a small paragraph on women. Now, what impact does that have? In a way, it completely reconfirms the national narrative, because first, my daughter, when she was a teenager, would ask me, so, and where is men's history? Now, so I mean, that's how teenagers are, right? Yeah. And it's a completely logical question, and she had any right to ask this question. Now, if you take the epistemological crisis of national history, and then it somehow makes its way into textbooks, the outcome might not be really desirable, because it reconfirms, and there was in fact a debate between two historians, Barbara Duden and Annette Kuhn, in the 70s. One suggesting that we should have more women's history, and everyone was beaten up because, you know, of neglecting women, and the other said, pointing out the epistemological problem that this would pose, because if it is not like we heard in the morning that, you know, women historians have kind of brought the idea forward that every history is gendered, then you basically can show this much better with the traditional narrative, right? Then you can show what's missing and who are the agents. Anyway, that was just my short example. Now, moving on. After 1999, national history saw a brief revival in the question of how to deal with the two Germanys and how to integrate their narratives. Is there something like a normalization of national German history, was the question. The question of how to deal with the second German dictatorship and whether it can be compared to the Nazi dictatorship also framed the debate for a while and continues to do so. There are all kinds of interesting things that go on around this question, which I can't go into. While this looking again at the now unified German nation is necessary after the enormous changes after 1989, the transnationalization of the historical narrative on low and various levels, be this European or a world historical level, is what more and more starts to frame curricular textbook debates. And to this I will now turn for the remainder of my time. Manuel Castells ended his 3-volume analysis of the current world with the statement that at present we are caught in a state of bewilderment, despite all our knowledge, of informed bewilderment to be sure, but of bewilderment nevertheless. A new knowledge frame that is more conducive to the ambiguities, complexities, and the unevenness of the world is needed. But this does not necessarily make teaching any easier. To quote Manuel Castells, The promise of the information age is the unleashing of unprecedented productive capacity by the power of the mind. I think, therefore I produce. Yet there is an extraordinary gap between our technological overdevelopment and our social underdevelopment. Which challenges does this situation of enhanced possibilities on the one hand and of dangerous unevenness on the other pose, and what are the issues that need to be addressed in education in general and in textbooks in particular? The pressure for change in school textbooks and curricula since the end of the Second World War has come from a variety of sources. First, of the increased agency of individuals. There are the increasingly authoritative rights and agency of individuals conceived as independent of and reaching beyond the national narrative. This trend correlates with the broadening of the human rights discourse and the creation of instruments to enforce individual rights within a transnational framework. Textbooks have been addressing these issues. The second point is the alternative stories and the stories of the underprivileged. The process of mass decolonization after 1945, which led to the creation of a multitude of newly independent states that now play a significant role at the international level, also contributed to an awareness and an assertion of the rights of formerly colonized people. With decolonization, peoples of Africa and Asia learned to employ European universals and to make European principles work for them in claiming their rights and identities. Like feminism, post-colonial thought has engaged those very principles that were instrumental in suppression of women, of indigenous peoples, of colonized populations, in order to overcome the oppressors' ideologies. Textbooks and curricula in Germany have been slow to embrace these aspects. In order to be able to tackle these issues, a consequently transnational framework needs to be applied. While thinking about Europe clearly is on the agenda, thinking about the world seems at this point more remote. A few remarks on the European framework, which Simone Laessig has been much more thorough on. Developing a European framework for thinking about history poses its own challenges. The last century witnessed the disintegration and destructiveness of 2 world wars and thereafter the relative stability of the Cold War. The themes of the Cold War were heavily guarded in Europe until 1989. Since then, they have come apart and new patterns are being created. Most of the debate is about how to position the nation nowadays in Europe, in Germany, how to position the nation in a European framework. This, however, is not a convincing framework in the face of a globalizing world. In a global framework, a discourse on Europe needs to address the fundamental ambiguity of Europe's historical guilt for imperialism and the fact that many universals like human rights historically originated in Europe, and that's very difficult to negotiate. The provincializing of Europe and its positioning in the world has yet to take place in textbook historiography. It has only begun to change scholarship in Germany, if at all, it has scratched the surface of historical beliefs. And in fact, when the European Union tries to push a common European consciousness, it does the exact same thing that the nation state has been doing all along, just transposing it on a different level, on the next higher level. Countries in Europe and the European Union strive to create transnational loyalties and a European consciousness, which is a long-lasting process which generates much talking and magic thinking and very little concrete successes. In Germany, there has been, we have heard this before, talk of a European textbook, and it will have to tackle all these questions if it will be useful in any way at all. All this comes down to the question of how to position Europe in the world in the face of the dualism of historical guilt and historical chance. The fourth point is the trope of different but equal. The era of the Second World War, the era after the Second World War, has at least in some countries also witnessed the celebration and codification of cultural standards that adhere to the principle of different but equal, the right to one's own identity and otherhood. Transnational agencies such as the United Nations and UNESCO have been major promoters of this trend, although the social movements have been even more important since the 1970s. Codified as rights, identities have become important organizational and symbolic tools for creating new group solidarities and for mobilizing resources, and this is particularly true for the United States. This can be observed in the cases of civil rights, women's and gay and lesbian movements, in the surge of ethnic and regional identities and interests, and in the collective articulations of indigenous groups and immigrants. These groups, which were previously excluded from various aspects of the national collective and citizenry, have raised their voices in demanding that their group narratives and identities become part of national education, among other things. The mobilization of social groups around principles of identity, new or old, progressive or regressive, have challenged the master narrative of the Western world on all fronts, and this process continues to have its impact on curricula and textbooks. For once, it created competing memories. Charles Mayer has shown in his article on consigning the 20th century to history the ways in which competing memories will have to be negotiated in the future. The two dominant narratives of the 20th century were what he called the Holocaust and Gulag memories. They each have their own logic. They are there and they need to be dealt with. However, the challenge of the present lies in alternative and especially in post-colonial narratives, and those are here to stay for a long time. It is these memories of enslavement, imperialism, and racism that are magnified through the one world that is growing together, magnified through worldwide migration processes. History textbooks have hardly even begun to tackle the questions of European guilt, of the long-lasting consequences of European imperialism, of uneven development, of ubiquitous racism and its sources. My sixth point is the question of globalization, and it's only 7 points, so the end is in sight. Democratization and liberal ideologies have been increasingly codified as globalization. The collapse of the dichotomous structure of world politics and the incorporation of the formalist socialist countries into the fold of Europe and the West in general after 1989 have played a major role in accelerating the globalization of these ideas and expanding their realm. The transformations in Southern and Eastern Europe, but also in Latin America and other parts of the world, while challenging the notions of development, modernization, liberalism, and democratization, have at the same time strongly reaffirmed these notions and strengthened their grasps, frequently using Enlightenment principles such as human rights and universalism. The Enlightenment idea of humanities has now become part of the global heritage. The stories being told thus need to embrace micro as well as macro levels. My last point is on the multiple modernities in the one world. As Michael Geyer and Charles Bright have argued, the process of a globalizing world produces a world of multiple modernities and uneven yet synchronized developments. Globalization, on the one hand, enhances integration and, on the other hand, proliferates difference. New forms of inequality spring up. Force worldization is what Manuel Castells has called these processes that privilege some and cast others into utter poverty, dependency, and ignorance. Processes that create growing numbers of people who are just not needed anymore on the labor market. These developments exclude entire regions and even continents, but they also occur within communities or between rural areas and cities. Karl Schlögel actually has analyzed the metropolitan corridors that combine metropolitan areas, but the trains just go through, like between Berlin and Frankfurt an der Oder. Everything, the little stops that are being made, would lead you into a no man's land of utter insignificance. In these processes, centers and peripheries at the community and global levels relentlessly attribute or withhold life chances for people. In the end, there is one world indeed, but not a world where everybody has adjusted to the same Western standards of modernity. Quote of Michael Geyer and Charles Bright, "The peoples of the world are pulled into processes of global interaction and emerge resegmented and transformed in their diversity. Educators need to be aware of these processes. One wonders how far-reaching the awareness of the postmodern differences really are in schools. But one thing is clear, the mixture of class, race, and gender issues that teachers face these days are obvious. And yes, class has re-entered the debate. In order not to get completely lost in these new complexities, enhanced through growing material as much as mental poverty, what is needed is to develop concepts and textbooks for a kind of basic knowledge that promotes a new consciousness that not only integrates but also transcends postmodern awareness of difference and enables students to orient themselves in a world where education might very well be part of an essential survival kit." To conclude, the current situation requires the rethinking of education and the role that history textbooks play on many levels. Education is at the forefront of a battle in which people attempt to prepare for the challenges of multiple modernities and for an integrated world of unequal access, hopefully providing tools of how to navigate this world and contributing to creating better chances for students and future generations in general. While the nation-state, since the second half of the 20th century, was affirmed as a universal mode of polity formation, the closure of societies and their definition as purely national collectives has become increasingly difficult to sustain, ideologically as well as institutionally. What counts as history has also changed. The epistemological crises around the questions of agency and of direction in history have revolutionized our thinking about history. And that's why Lynn Cheney can't recognize it anymore. The idea of a clear upward motion of history was discarded as Eurocentric, as were the notorious great men as the sole movers and shakers of historical development. The dominant Western narrative and construction of agency has given way to narratives of different histories with equal value, this being a much more accurate depiction of the complexities of today's world and competing views on this world, and perhaps someday leading to what Michael has called entangled histories. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am going to err on the side of shortness, given the exhaustion in the room and how much has been spoken today. Let me try, and if there will be questions, I'll be more than delighted to elaborate on that. I would start by sort of the excuse of me being here, which I'm not working specifically on textbooks, but what I am working on, and what we started 4 years ago, was an institute that is named Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation. This institute, which is an NGO, sits administratively at Salzburg Seminar. And the goal of that institute is to bring people who, identity-wise, belong to groups that are in conflict. The groups that we've done so far, are engaged so far, include Israeli Palestinians, Polish and Jews, Armenian and Turks in Uganda, and the big project that Charlie has been so modest in not developing, not describing it, because I think it is actually very crucial here, is for the former Yugoslavia. I only alluded to that, but that's the notion in those projects, and we are now beginning some major other projects this summer, including Northeast Asia and India. Projects that I think that in all of those cases, the idea is, how do you bring people who identify, however much the spectrum within the nation or within the identity is wide, but they are both recognized subjectively and objectively to belong to an identity group, how do you bring those sides to write together a shared narrative? In some respect, it is closely related to the question of textbooks and reconciliation and recognition. In some others, there is some distance between it. So it is against this background that my comments are going to be, that I'm going to make my comments, and please ask me about it more if you want, but that's just by way of a very brief introduction. I want to make 3 quick points in my talk. The first one is to talk questions of epistemological and methodological concerns about writing, between writing history, and we've heard a lot about the complexity of writing history, so I'm not going to rehearse all of that. But between that and the need to attend to a textbook which is a different kind of a product, which is the subject matter, my understanding of this day. So this is about one level of, if you want construction, if you want translation of kind of language and knowledge that has to be. The second point is I want to give a couple of examples of shared narratives, and third, by request, although that's, again, not my prime work, is not in this field, is to talk a little bit by way of reporting about a couple of projects of Israeli Palestinians who are working together and actually show the distinction and the relations between shared narrative and parallel narratives. And in 2002, Stanley Katz was reported in Common Knowledge to present a challenge. To sort of, and he says, talking about intellectuals without frontiers, and to ask how can intellectuals be involved more in the worldly events. And he said the task is to find and fund limited, well-defined projects that will apply our theoretical training and experience to urgent problems whose full complexities have yet gone unattended. So that was the challenge, Common Knowledge, and at the conference they took the challenge up. Last year, Jeffrey Pearl reported in it in Common Knowledge, and although the IHJR has not actually produced, but we only put sort of web pages with general descriptions of methodologies and our intentions rather than our products, Pearl was generous enough to attend to those web pages, and he commented on it. And let me read it to you, a paragraph I'm quoting from Pearl, and I'm taking that as the text from which I want to make the comments about the epistemological comments. Quoting Pearl. My impression is that this is not talking about the IHJR. This is not an organization for scholars or about scholarship, certainly not for scholars, students of the symbolic, of the variety that Lorraine Daston has argued are best prepared to unpack disputes. The historians that the IHJR locks in combat to produce joint histories are encouraged to picture their conflict as between both sides. But why are conflicts thought to occur between sides at all? As though they are board games or sports. And why is it so predictably 2 teams and an umpire that are invited onto the field? I wonder also about the phrase historical justice in the IHJR name. Is it not an idea of historical justice dry kindling for an uncontained fire? Should historians who hope to bring peace think in terms of justice, facts, and truth? So I would like to take this commentary, which is, I bet, well meant, but is not based on a lot of knowledge, as the sort of the challenge that we have of how does one engage, how do historians engage in this kind of work. Pearl continues, if peace is their aim, I would say they should concentrate in writing history on evidence of ambivalence, ambiguity, unclarity, paradox, covert agreement, and the mutual dependence of diametrically opposing claims. The problem as he sees it, and I continue to quote now, it is doubtful that historians whose methods impress non-scholars, those methods tend to be positivists, that is the opposite of the symbolic or the hermeneutic, are trained and poised to recognize the premises that enemies may share. Is reconciliation the likely upshot when participants in negotiation take for granted that sides are non-metaphorical, that facts are plain, and that truth and justices are causes that peacemakers are called upon to serve? So the students of the symbolic, the sophisticated scholar, as opposed to the positivist, the simpleton, are not trained to recognize the premise that enemies may share. And these enemies could not be viewed merely as two sides, as he claims, because it is too simplistic. So I think that we have to get beyond the claim that we have to get beyond the notions of two sides, and that there needs to be a shift to microhistory and to emphasize magnifying plurality. Now, I accept very much that the latter, the inclusions of microhistory and magnifying plurality is scholarly very sound, obviously. The question is, how do we translate that point into what the Skidmore conference that Pearl is reporting about and claiming to have an ironic scholarship that engages real-world conflicts. Those presumably have to include real people who view, as we have heard all together throughout the day, very much their groups as very real. How can we not ignore the idea that we have an audience, that we are part of that audience, that we have students, that we have teachers, that we have parents, that we have markets? We have gone through the day by talking about the various components that come into a textbook. How can that be without taking into account, or with engaging the symbolic and the plurality, but without ignoring the positivist side? Pearl goes to Latour for his answers. He quotes, all must be brought to see that facts, as their etymology indicates, are fabricated. And so are fetishes, God, values, works of art, political arenas, and nations. Here is where negotiations could begin, with the questions of a right way to build. We need to acknowledge that there exists no superior referee, no omnipotent fact or truth or historical justice, no arbiter, able to declare that the other party is simply irrational. So if facts are fabricated, recognized sides are too simplistic for conflict resolution, and there is no outside frame to adjudicate disagreements, where is one to begin? I would suggest that I promised short, so let me move. I would suggest that we move to practical solutions. And practical solutions for me is what informed us when we started the IHJR. By that we meant is what we needed to do is we needed to take groups that have a representative, they represent their identity, not just by biology or by heritage, but they represented their identity by feeling belonging to the group and being part of the group, yet are as close to their others as possible in bridging the group. I'll give you an example from the Israeli-Palestinian side. There's been sort of the school that in the Israeli scholarships have developed since the, I'd say mid-80s, but certainly since the 90s, are the new historians that have made. Some of the new historians, as you know, are post-Zionists. Others see themselves as Zionists, not as post-Zionists. The delineation is between who do you include in a group that discusses with Palestinians national reconciliation. Do you include post-Zionists or don't you include post-Zionists? No doubt there are Jews, Israeli Jews, who belong to them, whether the educational system. It's not about credential, it's not about quality of work, it's about the ability to represent the national point of view if you want to bring the two national points of view into negotiation. We more or less decided, we worked with individuals in both groups, in both societies, we more or less limited ourselves to those who would be otherwise called non-radicals, but more on the liberal end of the spectrum, with an attempt that if we say that the political liberal center is where you create the meeting, you try and extend it to as much as you can to the nationalist camp. You're not going to bring the nationalists on both sides to come to an agreement, the extreme, but you may create some kind of an initial agreement. And I think that this is, in terms of negotiation, the negotiation takes place, it's both political, but it is substantive. The rhetoric of history is very different than a political rhetoric. So the idea is not, I give you two massacres and you give some expulsions and some expropriations, etc. Obviously, that can be mockery. But on the other hand, exactly what kind of methodology, how do you focus on specific projects? How do you engage very specific good first-rate historical work, but do what is feasible, not what is not feasible.
Sorry, Elazar, does liberals mean the Zionists or the post-Zionists?
In this case, the post-Zionists are not included. The liberal among the Zionists, right? The liberals among the Zionists who view themselves as part of the national identity.
And can you also tell us a little bit what post-Zionism, what is a post-Zionist?
Okay, sure.
Just one sentence.
It's a tough one to do it in one sentence, but basically I would say that within the Israeli perspective, within the Israeli national mythology, the question that Zionism is a legitimate Jewish nationalism that ought to be maintained and keep the Israel as primarily a Jewish state, however liberal, equality, etc., falls within the Zionist camp. If you move to and this is self-definitional, okay. If you move to those Jews who in Israel who see that the component of being a Jewish state should be eliminated, and it should be a nation with a state without nationality that includes not only civic equality but also national identity equality, or non-national, or transnational, or post-national. This is the post-Zionist. The post-national comes from the post-colonial and the post-national in the international conversation. There are not many who belong in that group, but they're very influential. Okay, so if we're already in here, let me move in, sort of describe a couple of the projects that I wanted to discuss. One of them is actually sponsored not by us, but by Georg-Eckert, in Georg-Eckert Foundation mostly. And this is a project that has been going on for 5 years now, I believe, under an institute that is called PRIME, that is headed by one Israeli and one Palestinian, Sami Adwan and Dan Baron. And they have been doing, this is a very interesting project for multiple levels for what we have been discussing here, primarily because they only have academic advisors, but the work is done by teachers. It is not done for teachers, it is done by teachers. And the way they did it, they have, first of all, the Palestinian and the Israeli group. By the way, Israeli often, although it includes Palestinian Israelis, is often used only, obviously, to describe Jewish Israelis. So bear with me, and if I confuse you at any moment. But in any case, there was an Israeli. I don't think that in the Israeli group there were any Palestinian Israelis, but it was the Israeli group and the Palestinian group, and they first worked the teachers within themselves. Then they started working together. What is unique about it, at the time of a conflict. Everything that we've described so much, we're talking about 1848 or some. literally tens of decades or hundreds of years after the conflict. His is while the conflict is going on. So that is a very different pace in which it takes place. The Israelis are afraid of terror activities. The Palestinians are being harassed under occupation. So all of that, to bring those people who live the conflict in their daily life to write, it's been very difficult. Secondly, they've decided, interestingly enough, not to do joint narrative, but to do parallel narratives. So the book is organized in such a way that there is the Palestinian and the Israeli text, and in the middle there is an empty space for the students to interact with the text. Now, the text is being rejected by the nationalists, by the Ministry of Education, etc. It's been taught a little. It's been intellectually a fantastic success. It's been very creative. It is very good in the substance. But how far it can actually become public and large, it's more complicated.
What do you mean parallel? Around similar events?
Yeah, you have an event. For instance, one of the first events that they deal with, well, I could go, but one of the events that they deal with is 1929, there were, it's the second time that within the Jewish settlement in Palestine at the time that there was, and now the question, what was? There was a pogrom of Palestinians against Jews or an uprising by Palestinians against So what is being described, how is it being described, etc. So you have one narrative on one side of the page, another narrative on the other, an empty space in the middle. Teachers, so you don't have the authoritative voice of history, disappears altogether. You'll ask me more questions about it, but I'm moving to the next one.
Yeah.
Okay. The next one is the one that we are trying to do. It's not a textbook, but we have the project, the Israeli-Palestinian project, and that's what we do. We have at the moment two very specific projects. One of them is doing an atlas of the war in 1948. So again, it is done by Palestinians and Israelis, Palestinian and Jews together. The maps are made together. It does not aim at parallel narratives. It aims at one narrative. It's going not badly. We had 80 maps. We've been doing about 60. I hope that at the end of the summer we'll be quite well, and that includes annotations of it, whether it's expulsions, whether it's battles, whether, for instance, there's one of the important battles next to Jerusalem, whether it's heroic from the Palestinian perspective, or explanations. Anyhow, there's lots of details when we get into history, obviously. But to work it together was very interesting. There's another one which is holy sites, sites that are holy to Jews, Muslims, and oftentimes to Christians. How do you describe them together? We started with 14 sites, saying that we're not going to deal with the most controversial. The group that is actually working it included the most controversial. And they actually came up with a text, including the text for what is known as Haram el-Sharif / Temple Mount, which is the holiest and the most controversial one. The group came to the larger group to discuss it. Now go. It was not that it was not agreed whether to start in the 7th century or in the 10th century BC. It was not that the text was not agreed upon. The title couldn't be agreed upon. It would not, to have the title with a slash was too political. I mean, the fact that even from Islamic perspective, religious perspective, the Haram el-Sharif is there because it was because it was important to Jews, is not contested. The empirical evidence is not contested. The problem is that since Zionist settlement, it has become so political that admitting it was, and we have had that examples earlier today in various instances where it's not only for school children that it's the good and the truth that are in conflict, but even in terms of political. So here we have quite a lot of agreement. We think of these shared narratives when they are agreed upon as building blocks. We're not going to create a situation where everyone is going to buy everything in it. Obviously, that would be even naive for us, and we are optimistic. But I think that what it is possible is that we put out there, under joint authorship, of group authorship, and obviously it will not be quite as sharp as some would like, and it will have to give up some of the issues, but it will create building blocks for a joint narrative. I've gone long enough. Thank you. And obviously,
Dipesh, your wisdom.
Yes. Final few words. No, thank you. I mean, it's been a very rich day, and frankly, I mean, I must say, personally speaking, it has been so rich that I haven't found it to be tiring, because many interesting points came up. So, I actually did read drafts of Hanna's paper, and Elazar I listened to. So, in terms of my responses, perhaps there's more to say about what's gone on through the day, and I'll probably have a few things to say about what you're doing, the very inspiring example of your institute. Listening to the day's discussions, one of the questions that I was thinking about listening to everybody was this question that I guess we're implicitly asking ourselves is, what is the work we want textbooks to do? And there was a range of answers to it. And if I put the answers on a spectrum, then at one extreme was the expectation that textbooks would change subjectivity. Textbooks would mold you as a person, like Neeladri's ambition that textbooks would make of every child a critical person, a critical thinker, to the other extreme, which wasn't really quite articulated except as a question, textbooks as a way of passing exams and getting your degrees. And obviously, the reality is somewhere in between, depending on where one is talking about. But the second factor to bring into this, which Simone raised to some degree, is also the question of markets, that in the end, textbooks either have to be subsidized by the state, as in India, and even then good textbooks, as Neeladri was saying, don't reach more than 10% of the population in India, or they have to be marketed. And if they have to be marketed, then there's one problem that all groups, ethnic groups, identity groups face, is that if their culture and demography do not constitute a market, they miss out. This is a problem in India all the time, where every recognized language has hundreds of variants inside. In other words, the languages themselves have a history of oppressing other languages, which we now call dialects of this language. And sometimes there are democratic points made by textbook authorities saying we should have textbooks in the dialects. But the dialect speakers are so small that it doesn't make any economic sense to produce a textbook. So, in a way, there are these problems that are around the question of textbook. But to think about this, think about what do we want our textbooks to do, it helps me to, the problem of not just dialects. I mean, it's a problem that's faced by migrants. I mean, I've been party to a conversation amongst local Bengalis from both Bangladesh and India about whether or not Bengali could be made into a school language in the US. And you run into problems of skills, who will write a syllabus, do they have the credentials? There are all sorts of things which have to do with political institutions, market, where will you buy the textbooks, who will write them, who will publish them. So it's a global question. The market question, I think, is a very important question.
For Bengalis in the US?
Yeah, for Bengalis in the US, yeah. And then, so in some ways, the Eugene Weber's the title, which Hanna quoted for us, reminded me of another phrase, which in which one could say that what textbooks are doing and history books are trying to convert, just as peasants were being made into Frenchmen, we make pasts into histories. And I think it's just sheer unpractical to think that histories would be the only way that people will relate to their pasts. And people imbibe from childhood on all kinds of ways of relating to the pasts, including, things that are mediated by belief, things that are mediated by faith in grown-ups, belief in my parents. And these things are not ever completely displaced by secular democratic history writing that we do to produce citizens. And in that sense, textbooks, we didn't, unfortunately, this was a historians' gathering, so we didn't have either any historical or contemporary anthropology of textbook reading. So the only thing I can fall back on is my memories of reading textbooks and being produced as a citizen in independent India. And not history, I'm thinking of literature, but it's a literary representation of history. A poem was written by a nationalist poet in Bengal around 1909 against untouchability. And the poem addresses the untouchable person as a brother and says, who calls you impure and polluted? My brother, come and have a brotherly hug from me. That was the spirit of the poem. And some evenings my mother, who was a teacher of Bengali literature, would teach me this poem as part of my homework, explain it to me, give me the emotions that I was meant to imbibe from the poem, emotions against untouchability, to know that the caste system was bad. And the next morning, just as my mother would sit down to have her meal before going to her school to work, the untouchable person who cleaned the toilet in the house would turn up. And my mother would immediately remove all the curtains from his way so that he didn't touch any curtains. She would get us out of his way, and he, with a sort of, a broomstick and a bucket in hand, would go straight to the toilet to clean it. Now, imagine an ideal time in which this untouchable person and my mother and myself, if we could belong to the same generation, and if Neeladri was the Prime Minister of the country, imagine a time in which we'd all been through the schools that Neeladri had set up, and these were the only institutions that molded our subjectivity, and the three of us met as critical thinkers, and we would have nothing to be critical about. Because we would all have the same points of view, we would all relate to each other from similar points of view. So there's an interesting problem. I think in some ways, therefore, that's why the extreme of thinking that my textbooks will mold subjectivities, for me, is part of a totalitarian imagination. Even to make the demand that everybody will be a critical thinker, I often felt that I was very, very fortunate my parents weren't critical thinkers. So that because often what I write in English, because of the very idiomatic nature of English, comes out as irreverent if translated direct into Bengali. Irreverent of my traditions, my elders, and my parents, they were educated, but very wisely never looked at the contents of what I wrote. They felt very proud of the fact that I wrote. They would show the book to the grocer in the neighborhood. My son has written a book. Nobody took an interest in what was written in the book. And that allowed me a certain kind of freedom to move about in the world, where I write something else in Bangla, which they will read, and I write differently in English, because I write for a different audience. And in that sense, I think one has to place textbooks into this. Textbooks must not be a way of homogenizing. Even if textbooks present clashes of points of view, there must not be, we can't think of a point that everybody must occupy, or even that everybody should occupy in relating to points of view. In other words, the world is a dangerous place, and textbooks can't render it safe. Secondly, I want to say then that, but I actually think the debates about textbooks are very important. If you think about it, if my position is right, then you see the interesting thing about textbooks, it seems to me, is that debates about textbooks are usually carried out over the heads of the people who are going to read the textbooks. Normally. Even Neeladri made a valiant experiment where he actually involved students in discussing draft textbooks. This normally doesn't happen in the production of textbooks in India. But debates do take place. And these debates, I think, they are actually about, they restate the ideals of democracies we're living in. So I actually think they're intra-elite debates, and they are in some ways about rewriting, renegotiating, depending on the situation one is in, rewriting, renegotiating the social contract that we imagine as holding our society together around certain new agreements and new prohibitions. There could have been a different social contract which was made up of certain set of agreements and prohibitions. We want to change them. And I think what is very important in democracy is to fight for the safety of this space, where we can actually struggle as historians, as professionals, to keep alive this space where we actually debate the social contract as we live it out. But it does not mean necessarily that this will directly translate into the production of subjectivity. One of the most interesting things in India is that because of Indian democracy and because marginalized castes have been drawn and politically energized, drawn into the Indian electoral process and politically energized by the electoral process, there's a phenomenal rise in the demand for pastes, which I've also seen in the Australian context amongst Australian Aboriginals. Maoris in New Zealand have gone through this. And what I find very striking when I look at it is that the demand for pastes does not translate into a demand for textbooks written by academics. It actually often is a demand for more myths that will make this ex-marginalized people feel proud of themselves. It translates, and here I think there's some reverberation of your work. For instance, there are New Zealand historians, Miranda's just left, and Salmon's two histories. New Zealand historians have been experimenting for a while with trying to bring different kinds of histories together. In fact, John Pocock has a very interesting essay in the New Zealand context on this question. One of the interesting demands that has come up in the Australian context from Aboriginal and pro-Aboriginal historians is to, every place where there is a statue of an Australian explorer, which is a tribute to the settler colonial narrative, to have a statue to Aboriginals killed by the settlers. Now, it's beyond the textbook, but it is about reconciling history. It is about shared past, but kind of acknowledging the conflict that also makes up the shared past. So it seems to me, just to, I don't want to prolong this, but just to finish up and make 2 or 3 points, it seems to me that that while, these processes and what we do in the textbooks are not mutually exclusive, and sometimes one can overlap, but I'm simply trying to say that it's probably good to ask ourselves this question: what practically do we want our textbooks to do for us, and not to have extremely totalizing, either only to pass exams or to completely mold subjectivity, not to have those two extremes as our imagination. But having said that, let me say where I think Hanna talked about EU, and a lot of stuff that you said about EU resonated with what Neeladri was talking about this morning. And I think Michael's point, which was a very important point he made this morning, I thought, which is a distinction between, say, a country like Japan, which was a nation even before it became an empire, and a nation like India, which is a product of an empire. And it still has an imperial structure. There are still people like the Nagas who've been forcibly drawn into the nation. And there is the whole question of how do you accommodate diversity in the production of the textbook is very important. And interestingly, I think you mentioned it, and it came up in questions of Central Europe. And from my own personal experience in talking to people to the east of Central Europe, people from Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, those regions, the interest in post-colonial stories are fascinating, because they are also trying to imagine multiple Europes. And again, within Europe, you again have different imaginations of Europe, from the extreme of fortress Europe, right, to other kinds of inclusive Europe. But what's fascinating, even when you look to a liberal left intellectual whom I respect, otherwise very much like Etienne Balibar, trying to talk about Europe and immigration, Balibar feels obliged to construct a very positive, radical tradition as Europe, right, which is not fortress Europe, against fortress Europe, but suddenly he's drawing on what is only partial Europe, and a history of being open. But at the same time, I once said to him, why call it Europe? Why would you still want to call it Europe when, there wasn't a clear answer to it. But speaking to him, it always reminds me that, since we're talking about Europe and history, that there was one very important post-colonial intellectual, Frantz Fanon, who believed in Europe in the sense that he has this wonderful sentence at the end of The Wretched of the Earth where he says, all the ingredients for the emancipation of human beings are available in European thought, but the only way we can use them is by forgetting history. Which is a very interesting position of actually being a Europeanist, being from the colonies, and seeing the path ahead as one where you have to forget history. And because it's such an extremist thought, that his thought, as you know, becomes a thought about implosion. And he has to use violence eventually as some sort of redemptive metaphor for what that transformation would mean. But today, let me end by making these 2 points. One is that historians' response to globalization, at the level of writing textbooks, at the level of framing courses, the level of writing articles that, like Michael has done, and we all have done, is to really get interested in world history and transnational history, connected history. These are the terms that have come up. And world history has taken a different collocation. Like when Nehru wrote letters called Glimpses of World History stood for internationalism. Now world history stands for being connected, global processes. But when I think about it, I think that this is going to be supplemented, at least in the next few decades, by something else, which, in order to explain which, let me coin two terms and explain those and finish what I have to say. When I look at European thought from the Enlightenment on, I find one kind of thinkers whom I, in my head, called, these are people who are celebrants of the species. They write ultimately histories of, optimistic histories of how wonderful this species is, the human being. And Kant, Hegel, Marx are my exemplars of that. That in the end, this species will bring something good. They'll bring some paradise on earth. And you have other kinds of thinkers, European thinkers, whom I think of in my head as species anxious. They're anxious about the species. Malthus is one of them. There's always this anxiety whether will capitalism finish the species off. And given the environmental talk that is now being taught by the last UN report and everything, if global warming really persists in the way that it is, that scientists are saying it will, if the sea levels rise, then one of the things we face in the next 3 or 4 decades, in my region of the world where I come from, that 1/3 of Bangladesh will go underwater. If 1/3 of Bangladesh goes underwater, the people will come to India. Because some of India will also go underwater. What sort of histories will we write? Goes back to Michael's question. And it seems to me that at some point we will have to go even beyond world history and transnational history and connected histories and begin to think of species history in order to actually write histories that are adequate to what looks like the coming crisis of the 21st century. The environment has proven to be the most effective critique of capitalism and the industrial way of life. So, thank you.
Well, do we want to debate? I'm quite sure we would. You have 20, 30 minutes. Okay, Jake?
Yeah, I have two comments. The first one is we've heard a lot, almost all the presenters talked about how these nationalist narratives in textbooks have been used to mobilize the nation against internal and external others. But we haven't really talked about another use of these nationalist narratives, which was also extremely important, which is to efface economic inequality and repress class conflicts. And from what I've heard about the sort of emerging transnational and multicultural alternatives to the old nationalist narratives, it seems that the new narratives are doing the same thing. And I think that, at least in the case of China, that's very clear, because this new Shanghai textbook removes the Maoist era glorification of class conflict in the interest of creating a harmonious, so-called harmonious society at a time when class conflict is currently very high in China. So while I agree with the goal of encouraging pluralism through our use of textbooks, I think we also have to ask ourselves how meaningful pluralism is in a context of radical economic inequality. And my second comment is that all the countries we've talked about in the last 30 years have gone through free market structural adjustment. And I wonder if we can use that as an explanatory variable in understanding how both in the creation of these transnational narratives and in the sort of resurgence of nationalist narratives in, say, in the American case or the Japanese case, as a means of dealing with the social consequences of the neoliberal reforms of the last generation.
Can I pick this up, if you don't mind? Because this is one thing I'm actually sitting at the moment in this last chapter of this global history I'm writing, which is on the period post-1970s to the present. we've radicalized the statement you've quoted on the re-emergence or reproduction of difference quite dramatically, in the sense that we now systematically reinsert class as an issue. But the problem is class is still part of a functional universe of economic division of labor. As such, it's extremely important, because you can indeed locate inequality. But the problem of inequality is really way beyond that, because you have entire people or populations really that are not in this interconnected, interactive, and deeply divided and unequal whole. They are outside, so I mean, the question is how do, and they are barely connected or actually thrown out, and this happens both in the metropole as well as in the various new peripheries. And the question is, how do you cope with this kind of population, with these kinds of people? They are your Bangladeshis, in as much as they stay in Bangladesh rather than go to Singapore and work, where they are part of our class society, and as such very easy to handle. Well, not easy, but they are. I can handle them, as a historian. I can deal with that kind of population, remittances and everything. But the populations that are flushed out and effectively.
Who are you talking about, Michael?
I'm talking about a whole group of Africans, entire groups of African societies, which are effectively disconnected from any kind of interactive, the neoliberal exchange. That if they participate in the global economic or information structure, they're effectively only participating through charity, or they participate through very indirect means, not in any case being part of that global division of labor that produces one part of the global world. So what do you do? I mean, how you integrate those populations into a history, into a global history that effectively excludes them?
But Michael, I'm just thinking that if some of these societies are results of, let's say, World Bank or IMF induced structural adjustments and things of that sort, why could, say the African mineral belt, where there are many sort of societies have unworked recently. Sierra Leone is one case in point, right? It's a warlordism based on a diamond-based economy.
You basically
right?
then
and multinational companies have been involved in Nigeria and places. The oil companies have played a role. So what I'm asking is,
but in Sierra Leone, that is a very selective part of a very selective part of the country. Now it's a highly coveted part of the country, hence it is fought over, and it's fought over by various people. But that is, at best 10% of that population, and the disconnect to the rest is.
I don't see your problem, Michael.
Yeah.
I don't see your problem. If we're talking about any kind of global incorporation process, there are always people at the margins, and there's always the case that global processes are continuing to encompass. They don't ever get to everybody. And this is a perfectly legitimate situation in which we can continue to apply the categories of inequality, even if we can't easily apply formal class categories. So I think we can see another kind of inequality operating at the margins. But if your main agenda is the globalization, well, we've got quite a lot to talk about within that. And then to talk about those who are, it's not that the system isn't continuing to expand. Of course it is. It hasn't reached everybody. Simply being
no. There I disagree with you, because the incorporation also excludes. Right. And I think as opposed to previous stages of incorporation, where the exclusion simply produces parallel society that are relate to the global society in a disconnect or in some kind of subaltern, in a global subaltern position. What you have is actually the Sierra Leone is a good case, the actual destruction of that other society. You basically have superfluous people who
But
barely
can I
exist.
just ask, what is the issue? I mean, is it that these people sort of fall out of the radar of possible scholarly knowledge? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I think they fall out of the radar of survivability. That seems to me the danger at the moment.
But that, okay, so that's the issue. So then is that different from the increasing sort of stratification in American service society, right? Where when you did have unions and working class and so on, there was much more. But now, of course, now you see service at two complete ends. And they've also pretty much fallen out.
No, I mean, my effort was to cope with Jake's question, and what I tried to answer is that is a problem I do have concretely. The problem is I can't deal with highly strategized, stratified society that stratify over huge distances. That I think you have to learn how to do that, but I think that is possible. What I have a hard time to deal with is societies about whom we were happy about 20, 30 years ago, the kind of authentic societies outside of the system, which I now see increasingly as the completely endangered societies, that is, their survivability is in danger. And since this is a good part of, certainly a good part of Africa, it would have that kind of
I was just
society at the edge of survival would be a part of, would have to be part of that history. And that, I mean, obviously it is often dealt with as a natural history, you know, in terms of, you know, Bangladesh going underwater. But I think it is actually a political history rather than and a social history rather than a natural history of these populations. What Hannah Arendt called superfluous populations.
I have a question, but we can come back.
Responding to the question of economic dimension to the textbook attacks, I just can't tell other countries, but in the Japanese case, nationalists always attack the description of labor movement, description of the division of poor and wealthy. So they, we focused on the war memory issues, but always nationalists. There are the targets of nationalist attack included economic dimension to it, and the epoch relays 1955, 79, and 1995 actually sort of in different ways we interpret it. It's the three moments. At that point, Japan had some economic issues to deal with. So that is not to me, it is not a coincidence, but at the same time, Mark and I have talked about it over several weeks and months, but we just didn't include it in our paper. So just quickly to talk about 1955 and next year 1953, actually Japanese government announced that there's no longer post-war. So it is a beginning of Japanese economic miracle or Japanese recovery from the post-war economy. And the 1970s or 1980s is basically the moment when Japanese internal market reached the maximum. Although Japan was able to expand its economy in terms of external economy, basically Japanese companies expanded or more shifted its emphasis into the external market. And actually in 1990s, actually the reach of Japanese companies in the external market reaching a certain maximum also. So it's a sort of three moment in economic union to it. I'm not sure about to explain it in terms of structural adjustment, but certainly I think it is a useful framework to understand it. It is meaning that economic dimension to the textbook patterns is basically a useful dimension. Although we haven't really gathered the empirical evidence to back it up, so it's still the sort of theory.
I'm not sure this is going to make much sense, but over the course of the day, and I think especially with some of the comments, including this last one, about the globalization and the margins, it seems to me one of the things we haven't much talked about, the word came up a few times, and that is citizenship. And it seems to me rather important that one of the things that's getting lost in historiography as well as in life is citizenship. Identity is multiple and diverse. Citizenship is, at least allegedly, at least formally, equal and same. So these histories, if they're to make citizens, have to do a lot of forgetting. This was Renan's point in 1882 when he talked about what is a nation. And somehow, not that I want to advocate this, but it seems like there is something inherent in the nation that requires this forgetting. And maybe the other side of that is, though, that as we move outside of the nation, we lose the resource of citizenship, which is a huge loss, it seems to me. And that, if there were citizenship, there would be some way to connect these people. We are not going to world citizenship. This is what the whole point about the European Union, what they are able to do or not, except so far this is not helping the most marginal folks who are within the European region now. And it's only a few years, who knows what happens. Anyway, I do think that there is an issue that citizenship runs through this thing both within the nation and outside of the nation, and it's a dilemma in both places.
But perhaps just a comment on it. I think that the tension between citizenship and the nation is something that has been so strong in the 20th century. I mean, we have touched it on multiple ways. I'm not talking outside the state. I'm talking within the state, not the EU citizenship, but the issues of minorities, the issues of groups, the issues of group rights. All of that is it's a crucial tensions within it. And I think that much of what we've been doing here, talking about it, has very direct relationship to that. So, I mean, the way that you write, whether it's within the nation, within the state, including and forgetting or whatever it is, that's exactly the subject matter of that. Whether we talk about, I mean, I can make a whole list of what we've done today, whether it's Germany and the expellees or the various states within Central Europe or the Middle East, wherever you go, the tension is between those two things, and the history books, even more, the textbooks, even more than the historical work, which the individual historians work, but the textbook actually is a very good manifestation of that. It's a mirror of what is synthesized by the amorphous group at that moment.
Yeah, I guess all I would say, though, is that citizenship, I agree with your description.
Right.
But it seems to me that the formal quality of citizenship confers a claim.
Absolutely. And the tension between that claim and the nation is at the core of what much of what we discussed. I absolutely agree with you.
And I think this is also the sort of the criticality, the sort of the leftist, the cosmopolitan vision is in fact a citizen vision, as opposed to the more narrowly construed nationalist claims, which try to.
Isn't there an interesting difference here between the claim that the individual makes to the state, and that is, I think, the claim of citizenship, and it's based on the constitution. And on the other hand, the nation's claim on the individual, especially in the case of conscription, if you have to go to war and if you have to make a total commitment, including self-sacrifice. So in order to enable a person to make a claim, accept the claim of the nation, you have to have some mobilizing element in this whole input. And usually this is where the national narrative comes in, pride and the values and so on. These are two really conflicting tensions that sort of make up the nation. And from this
I think Charles was before.
And I think this is one of the dichotomies between this East and Western European problem that we have. In Central Europe, Eastern Europe, we talk a lot about ethnic nationalism and constitutional nationalism. I think that in the West, and I include the whole West European progeny, there is the acceptance, at least by elites, that citizenship is blind as far as ethnicity, religion, culture, whatever, although there are pressures certainly within those countries not to make that broad definition. In Eastern Europe, what I see is a much greater legitimacy the idea of saying you have to be part of our national group really to have bestowed upon you all the real rights of citizenship.
You want to?
Well, I just think that this is what Charlie says is presumably true in a very segmented and specific period, primarily in the post-war period during the Cold War. I think that first of all, once you start including the immigrants in Western Europe, that falls by the wayside. That the issue of what is the nation and the citizens, that doesn't work anymore.
Doesn't it? The pressure is there certainly to make
well, okay. I mean, at the moment, that's exactly the tension between having a nation and what does it mean being one or another. I mean, that's exactly the tension at the moment in Western Europe.
What do you say? Now we have
just quickly.
You first.
Just wanted to say,
and you come in anytime you want.
Going back to the Renan essay.
Yes.
It does seem to me that while he is talking about the national amnesia that's needed, but from what I see and what I've read, it seems to me that the amnesia actually is not about society forgetting, but society remembering in such a way that it does not impinge on the construction of public life, common public life. And so in India there are many cases where Hindu-Muslim conflicts are recited, literally sung or recited, in such a way that it's not immediately feeding into a law and order problem or making for a riot, but it's an everyday affair. But you see, the societies have ways of archiving those memories, and they retrieve at particular points. So I'm just saying that
I think that is what he has in mind.
So that
if you call it complete forgetting, or forgetting in a certain way,
but that's why
or remembering.
But that's why the citizenship is a pertinent point. It's about the public-private distinction.
Yeah.
See, that's why it seems to me that so long as I think it's anti-human to think that human beings will be without prejudice, in a Gadamaryan sense, right? But the problem is, what do we do with prejudice in public life as we live together?
And the scholars,
what do? I just wanted to sort of bring this issue to the whole issue of Europe that our Europeanist colleagues were bringing up, which is that I'm not at all sure that the kind of region that they're trying to create in Europe is similar to nationalism. In fact, it may be more similar to, in fact, the multinational state in some ways, and both its failures and success, in the sense that you have, because in a sense the nationalist apple has been bitten, right, and it's not going to be easy to sort of get out of those. On the other hand, is what the European project one of trying to relocate citizenship at the higher level, right? And then so you get this sort of divergence. I mean, this also has, I do agree, this has to be seen in its economic dimension and the changes in the nature of capitalism and all of these kinds of things. But politically, is that the model that I just wanted to get a sense, yeah.
Well, you opened up an interesting question with the citizenship issue. Part of what's going on, whether it is on the globalizing level or on the Europeanizing level, is that the nation state needs to be rethought, and that is exactly what citizenship is about. And we are not interested in dissolving citizenship. But what do we do, for example, with illegal immigrants? When we all would like to try to school the children. Now, they don't have citizenship rights. Their status is very insecure and they could be expelled, but there is a human right to education. Yeah? So we ask the nation state to reinforce a universal human right, which at the same time undermines its citizenship notion. Yeah? So this is, I think, are the issues that we are dealing with on some level. So it is really also about a repositioning of the nation state as an intermediate between universalisms and particularities.
And that's the good version. I mean, Jan Zielonka effectively interprets the new European space as an imperial space, except that he can't quite define the imperialist. What he is right about is certainly the Eastern European perspective that argues what we get is a whole system of norms, of regulations, of laws that define what we can and cannot do, and that are the principle, that are the precondition for our admittance to reasonable chance of well-being. That is part of that European economic community, so, which is tied indeed to a number of norms. Now, of course, what Zielonka doesn't quite argue is that indeed the main norm is, and the most effective norm is the human rights norm, which has been strengthened over the last 15 years quite considerably, although it's pretty, it has huge holes in it, but still it is there, and that is an interesting potential because it gives rights of personhood rather than, which is of course Yasemin Soysar's whole idea, which didn't quite pan out then, but now does in a way. It gives rights of personhood where citizenship no longer quite grasps people, because I mean at this point you have millions of people, certainly in France but everywhere else as well, who are not citizens and yet ought to have rights.
But think of the etymology of citizen, which has nothing to do with nation, right? It's from the city. So that why can't it be expanded to the species?
Well, I mean,
I think these two guys have had a hand up
for a long time.
Mauricio, you want to speak to this issue, and then Neeladri, you want to speak something.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mauricio.
Two comments. The first is I think that I wrote about the issue of citizenship very strongly, although it was not maybe it was not very clear that this is precisely what I was talking about. Taking what you seem to be, all the Europeans here seem to be very sort of ambivalent about European and everything. First of all, keep in mind two things. Yes, from Germany or from Central Europe or the newcomers to the European Union, things look different. From Spain, it looks completely different. It looks a very successful story, which now is beginning to have the bad side, which is immigration, which is exactly the same problem that Germany and everything. But in terms of citizenship, in terms of equality, I believe since Charles V of Germany, for the first time Spain is really accepted as a European, and Portugal the same. And so it is successful, and this citizenship is a very important issue to keep in mind. Whatever happens in the future with the European Union, this is a very interesting example. Europe doesn't have to be a geographical location, a well-defined historical entity. It has to be that entelequia, so to speak, which is now in the minds of my generation and younger generation of Erasmus kids in Spain and Portugal, which they don't really know what it is, but it's good. And it's good not only because it includes citizens' rights, it includes a lot of money to develop. A money that was never invested, and I go to my other case, in Mexico. There has never been a Marshall Plan for Mexico. There has never been an European reconstruction plan as Portugal, Greece, and Spain for Mexico. And nevertheless, to go back to your point, Mexicans have done that.
died for the nation, for the United States. In all the wars of the United States. Mexicans are here. And we cannot think of a common citizenship. Doesn't matter the nationality, doesn't matter the ethnicity, we Mexicans are all Habsburgs. We are not going to force anybody to speak Spanish or anything. We are used to these crazy things. We are just asking for our good Ferdinand II to come back, Just, multiple societies in which we are not going to just belong to the same clusters with the same rights of the king and God. Well, the nation, this empire, they just have this citizenship issue in which these guys, Mexicans, have been so much apart, even dying, and not citizens. It is a very important example of how even the European Union being with all this failure, a very good example on how this is even unthinkable in the case of the United States. And my final comment, if Professor Chakrabarty is going to be the first mammal intellectual, I want to be with him. I don't want to be either the mestizo, the Mexican, or the American. I want to be mammal intellectual.
Neeladri.
Well, it's only partly to do with this, but it's a conversation with, Dipesh raised certain points, and I think it's important to address one central question which he's raising about deciding what the textbook wants to do, and the point about criticality. Now, I think what we need to recognize is that textbooks can, as you are saying, textbooks can never actually influence everyone and incorporate, provide versions of the past and ways of relating to the past which displaces other ways of relating to the past. That's something which we must recognize, and that is something which nationalist historians everywhere in the world in the past did not recognize. I think we have to begin with that assumption. It's not just begin with an assumption that there are limits to what we are doing, but also possibly, as you're mentioning, and I fully agree there, possibly recognize there is a value to other ways of relating to past. That is because these ways of relating to past, whether through myths, through stories, through local memories, through community,
through religion,
through the region, these actually socialize people into other communities. And citizenship, or one way of being, is should not necessarily displace other ways of being. Therefore, I fully agree there that the ambition of any text should not be to displace all other texts. I'm completely opposed. Displace other forms of relating to the past, other forms of constituting communities, other forms of defining relationships, and there. Will be the part of that multiple ways of being, which should be part of, and that's why the question is not simply, I think, citizenship. It should be also community. How do we constitute? What do we think? What are the ways of thinking about, productively thinking about, acceptable ways of constituting communities and problematic ways of constituting communities. That's something.
Can I go back to something that Simone actually raised, and I think Hanna's paper also included, which is the tension between the question of formal citizenship, and there's very interesting European discussions about precisely to do with whether refugees can be considered part citizens, grading citizenship in some ways, but still it's a formal connection to the state. The question that Simone was raising is the whole question of belonging. I mean, how do you, in other words, would European Union mean also a different way of belonging? And that's the question you were raising with respect to textbooks. And I think that is so there again, obviously we all allow for multiple belongings. And what I was trying to communicate through, trying to think about through this sort of species history, is that when we write histories of real crisis, right, crisis that affects us all, and affects us all as species, like if there's going to be, the projection is that in 30 or 40 years, 2 billion human beings are going to go without water, right? And this is for a creature that's 60-70% of whose body is made up of water. Now that's a disaster that faces us all, and I think at that level, for me, the intellectual challenge is, the only way we have thought about finitude, Heidegger included, is through the individual. In other words, the whole phenomenology of finitude is to do with the individual's inmost impossible experience of death. But can we think of the finitude of the species? In other words, can we extend that philosophical idea to actually thinking about the species? I mean, Hegel or Marx didn't think that. When you think of them, the species of the finitude was nowhere on the horizon.
The religions did.
The religions have tried to think about it because the religions relate to human condition, and some of these environmental crises bring the human condition to the fore. I mean, like something like bare life or barely human in Agamben's world. And it's really, how does one write histories of those histories that are looking to those moments where the belonging is neither European nor Indian, it is, but it's already happening. I mean, I'm sure that water will replace oil as the most scarce resource and the most important resource, and I wouldn't be surprised if in 40 years nations are fighting over water.
This is an interesting take on Mauricio's mixing water and oil.
Right. And now I've mixed them.
and the fact that, I mean, this is what you were saying. This is not recognized. The reality of the actual commonality of US
and the commonality of us is, you see, the global crisis is actually bringing us more together.
But what we do here is to reinsert a fundamentalism or a transcendental element, a new totality. In this case, the totality of potential liminality of the species, right? And that is indeed the transcendental.
But it's coming back differently.
We have to try to avoid at all costs in our history. The question is whether we should. I mean, the problem is, I think your argument doesn't quite pan out because, of course, the survivability not of species but of nations is very much at the center of very much of the thinking of the 19th and 20th century, and it has done a tremendous amount of damage.
In thinking nationally.
No, I just think that there's a lot of, I mean, obviously these are very crucial questions, but I think that in terms of when we're talking about textbooks and nations, the conflicts are much more local, or not local in the sense they're regional, whatever the place, more specific and identity.
Some crises are, absolutely, but there are other coming crises which will not be local.
Absolutely, but in terms of the kind of...
Hanna.
Yeah.
You do the final word.
I'm really pleased that we have such a lively discussion at the end of a very interesting day. I think it's great. I'm really intrigued by it. I don't have a final comment. I leave that to the organizers.
Tegu wanted to make a point, but it has to be very quick, I think, right, Michael?
But I still think we did not pay enough attention to the role of history textbook as a means for reconciliation. And to have like reconciliation, necessarily it involves a negotiation process. But like if we want to have like a negotiation process in between two parties or separate multi-parties, we have to sometimes we have to forget what happened in the past, or sometimes we have to negate what happened in the past, and then we have to justify our negation. And this is a really complex process. But even if we have like this complex process in this reconciliation process, and then what is the really strong interest behind our like moving toward this kind of negotiation process?
And what are the interests against it? More importantly, right?
Well, to give my answer to that, in 1947, when I was born, at the southern edge of Germany, at least my family very much still thought that the best thing for us would become Swiss. I effectively agree with that, much as I think in a certain variant of southern German thinking that the real unification of Germany would be with northern Italy rather than vision.
On that note,
It's Michael's personal view.
Can of worms. But
it's all local, right?
Very clearly, the problem of bridging these huge gaps that have opened up. In this case, the Swiss just didn't want us.
Well, that's a problem.
How about if we all become Swiss?
They would not like that either. I tell you, they would have to subsidize too much.
But there's xenophobia in Switzerland. We embrace easily.
11-month.
What you reminded me of, and what I kind of spoke rather negatively about at the beginning, and then the kind of damage control history. I think we need a lot of damage control, and much as my family was pro-Swiss, it was also pro-French. And I think that kind of damage control was the first necessary step of overcoming what had been an alienation that was very temporary. I mean, it was really came out. There is an older history of really pro-French and pro-Napoleonic sentiment, out of which this particular family comes, right? But overcoming that, it needed, in the first instance, the kind of simple textbook damage control that prohibited, as it were, the most extreme kinds of national histories. And that set in motion a process in which then, at the end of which then Neeladri's vision for an Indian history is. I mean, that seems to me a really wonderful vision. It seems to me would be, if we could import you to Europe, you should write the text for Europe, including Spain and Portugal.
Some people have to go, so I think we have to. Some people.
Thank you to all.
Thank you very much.
Very nice to meet you. Very nice to meet you.